I met Richard at a downtown charity auction when I was 26. He was charming in a way that smoothed out the edges of every room. A practiced laugh, an open hand on the small of my back, compliments arranged like satin ribbons. I told him I was a consultant, low-key, building my career slowly. He told me he was between projects. He insisted we marry in the spring. His parents offered a modest reception at their country club, and I learned early that their modesty masked teeth. From the first month I moved into their oak-paneled house, the contrast was clear. Margaret Langley, Richard's mother, wore diamond studs and called me Eleanor the Volunteer when she meant the help. She had a way of sliding into a room like a temperature drop and treating my tidy thrift store dresses like an offense against family branding. "You should save money, dear," she'd say, counting her pearls as if they were an audit. Chloe, Richard's younger sister, was a social media princess who owed everyone favors and paid none of them. The jokes were constant. "Eleanor, bring another plate. Eleanor, we can't find the coats. Did you take them again?" The house ran like clockwork, but I was the silent spring, late nights cleaning, early mornings catching the bus in January snow while they drove off to brunch. The truth I hid from them was messy and beautiful. I was not poor or powerless. My mother had died when I was 19 and left behind a small, complicated fortune concealed in trusts and shell LLCs because she knew how jealous money could make people. I had spent years learning to read balance sheets the way other women read novels. I went to grad school for forensic accounting on scholarship, built a quiet career that paid in days and nights rather than fanfare, and, after my mother's trust matured, I placed the assets behind layers of irrevocable trusts and nominee corporations. There were reasons I never told Richard. My mother's last wishes were strict. Never allow money to buy loyalty. Let love decide itself. So I kept my name off the deeds. I let Richard call me Eleanor the Volunteer because I wanted to know what he would choose if he ever had to. At night, after the dishes and the fake laughter, I sat on the cedar deck in the cold, laptop perched on my knees, logging into corporate portals under pseudonyms, checking ledgers in the small hours. My feeding of the household, quiet grocery runs to the discount market, coupon clipping, looked like thriftiness. In reality, it was deliberate. I let them see thrift because I wanted to measure their reactions when true wealth showed up. They needed someone disposable, and I played that part with surgical precision. I took the bus when it snowed. I wore sweaters with tiny pills. I accepted errands and insults. I volunteered for the bake sale, the PTA, the endless help set up for the luncheon. That meant my hands smelled of sanitizer and my shoulders carried their world. Richard loved to correct me about money. "You're so careful, Ellie. That's so adorable." He would laugh in a way that sounded like a judge. But I was not submissive by accident. I was patient. I was watching, cataloging, and waiting for the moment their greed would expose itself for what it was. A hunger, not an entitlement. It took 3 years before the plan unfolded. The first sign was small. Richard started staying late at the office more often, his expenses subtly swelling. Gifts for Chloe multiplied, designer bags that appeared as if conjured. Margaret started mentioning a loan in passing, in addition to the garden mortgage that she would sort out later. They were living beyond a modest couple's means, and their credit cards answered with interest rates and explanations they dismissed. I began my audit in earnest when Richard lost a major client. He masked the panic with jokes and insisted he could close another round if he had liquidity. Margaret, by this point, had moved from casual sniping to active manipulation. She suggested, over roast chicken and candied yams, that I sign a post-nup to protect his business partners if anything went wrong. "It's standard," she said, the way a surgeon describes an amputation. The word that followed, "We love you, dear," was a scab over a blade. They wanted to make my wealth disappear on paper. They drafted a post-nup in a meeting where Chloe teetered in 6-inch heels and Richard smiled at me like a man who expected obedience. The proposed clauses were brutal. I would renounce claims to the marital residence, waive any community interest in unspecified business goodwill, and agree that any assets under nominee names would be considered separate and irrelevant. Essentially, sign and be invisible. The second act of their conspiracy moved faster. Chloe's boyfriend, a slim, oily man named Marcus who applauded at every family anecdote, suddenly needed a place to stay. Samantha Reed, Richard's new assistant, moved in within weeks. She was 22, polished, and gifted at the art of appearing grateful. They celebrated her presence with lamb and champagne and whispered about fresh starts. Margaret suggested hosting a broker dinner where partners would meet Samantha. I was expected to bake and smile. Then the audacity arrived. After a late dinner, Richard slid a printed post-nup across the coffee table like a domestic decree. "It's for the company, Ellie. It protects everyone." He told me he feared insolvency, that the minor holdings my mother left could complicate a capital raise. "We're in this together," he said. His tone carried the assumption that I would trade my dignity for a neat signature. When I refused, their faces did what greed always does. They tightened into anger. Margaret's voice went thin. "You don't understand the pressure he's under," she hissed at me in the kitchen. "If you love him, you will make it simple." Chloe's smile flipped like a switch. She called me stubborn and ungrateful. Samantha, who had learned to sip water like a woman who could only be poured into place, tilted her head and made a note as if this were a seminar. Then, as if to finish the job, they did something unforgivable. They hired a local process server to deliver me an official notice, an eviction notice, under the fabricated claim that the marital residence belonged to Margaret and that Richard's cohabitation rights were being renegotiated. It was a paper dagger, a public humiliation designed to force me to sign under pressure. They thought spectacle would break me. They thought I was a woman of boxed hands and folded knees. They were wrong. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in public. Inside, something went still and precise, like the click of a well-built watch. I had anticipated betrayal. I had structured my life around the assumption that greed would come calling. The eviction notice became my breadcrumb. I started by setting a legal trap that was cold and methodical. I contacted Julia Park, an old law school friend who now specialized in trusts and estates, and arranged for an emergency consult under the guise of advice for a neighbor. I gave Julia a sealed folder that, on the exterior, looked like the typical paperwork of a worried wife, but inside were copies of corporate filings, nominee LLC papers, bank reconciliations, and a redacted list of transfers implicating Richard and Margaret in the misappropriation of company expenses for personal use. Evidence is the most delicious instrument of revenge, but it must be curated with care. I had already anonymized invoices, matched them to credit card statements, and cross-referenced vendor payments that Richard had directed through shell companies I had quietly created years earlier to protect the trust. Next, control of narrative. I drafted emails in which I recited, calmly and factually, the chain of transfers from Langley Investments to Chloe LLC and to Marcus Holdings. I requested records for corporate expenditures and tied them to purchases, jewelry, the country club membership, payments for Samantha's apartment. I also prepared a notice of intent to file a forensic audit through a reputable boutique auditor I had retained years ago for a different reason. Habit. The boutique firm was discreet and ruthless. They had a way of converting a family meal into a ledger of crimes. I summoned the instruments that would unmake them. A revocation clause tucked inside the trust I controlled, a board resolution pre-signed by the nominee directors, because I had once been patient enough to plant allies on Richard's company's cap table, an irrevocable power of attorney that triggered upon the filing of a complaint and the legal muscle to freeze accounts. I drafted painstakingly worded letters, each a scalpel, that hinted at a larger complaint to the SEC for misclassification of personal expenses as business deductions, and a civil suit for constructive fraud. But I understood spectacle mattered. To humiliate them in private would be satisfying, but public ruin carries durability. I planned the reveal at a place none of them could control, The Langley family's 50th anniversary celebration, a fundraiser at their own country club where donors and local press would attend. Margaret loved that party. It was a monument to her image. If I toppled her there, the collapse would be televised through every social ether they prized. There was an ethical line I almost crossed: criminal referrals, immediate arrests, but I wanted them to feel the slow suffocation of legal consequences first. Frozen bank accounts, notice of lien recorded against the property, a formal board vote removing Richard from his CEO role for cause, and an audit report that would make their finances public, igniting creditors. So I orchestrated the legal dominoes. I also prepared for their emotional counterattacks. I knew Margaret's defense was theatrics, tears, vintage brooches, a staged fainting. I created a dossier of statements they might make and drilled my responses with Julia. The key was to remain unflappable, to let the law and the evidence speak, while my voice remained a controlled instrument. Finally, I executed a small public move that would unbalance them. 3 days before the anniversary, I filed a quiet petition to transfer deed ownership of the marital residence, an action allowed under a clause in the trust that granted me the right to transfer properties for asset protection into a newly created LLC that I controlled. The deed transfer, properly recorded, created a cloud over any attempts to mortgage, sell, or transfer the property without my consent. I also recorded a notice of lis pendens, notice of pending litigation, so the world would see the house had legal baggage. It was subtle but surgical. Anyone trying to cash the house out would now find the taps turned off. Then, with the deed and the audit motion in place, I wrote the press release and the polite invitation I would send to the club's manager. A note requesting an urgent meeting during the anniversary cocktail hour to discuss a pressing family matter I would present to the board. I also quietly alerted the boutique auditors to be on standby with the final forensic report at the exact hour I chose. Everything else that would topple them, bank freezes, board votes, lien filings, was already cued to fire the moment the club manager allowed me a table at the event. I slept very little in those days. I tasted revenge like a recipe being tempered. There was no malice in my hand, only precise, inevitable law. The country club smelled of roses and cheap cologne the night of the anniversary. Margaret wore her pearls like armor. Chloe wore the same dress she'd photographed for Instagram the week before. Samantha hovered near the buffet, smiling in the way a woman who expects applause smiles. The press had a small presence for the anniversary gift showcase, a few local columnists, a socialite blogger who liked scandal for likes, an audience, at last. I arrived in a modest dress I had chosen deliberately, plain, no jewelry, a snug navy I had bought from the same discount bin they'd mocked. They smirked. Richard offered a patronizing bow and the look of a man who thought victory certain. I asked to speak at the end of the toast. Margaret pretended not to notice until the manager, perhaps worried about disruption, waved a napkin for silence. I walked to the small lectern under the chandelier, the room tightening like a noose. I did not raise my voice. I opened a briefcase, placed a stack of printed documents on the lectern, and smiled the way a surgeon smiles before incision, calm and absolute. "Good evening," I said. The room leaned in, expecting some sentimental anecdote. I promised Margaret a few years ago I would always be loyal to family. I keep my promises, but loyalty is a contract of truth, not of silence. Margaret's lips thinned. Richard's jaw clenched. Chloe's fingers flew to her phone. I asked the manager for the microphones to remain active and signaled to the boutique auditor, he was at the bar, quiet as a judge, to stand with another screen we had rented. The club's manager, sensing the story, allowed the small technical disruption. I had arranged guests to film discreetly. The cocktail chatter went mute as the screen flickered on. Then I began to tell the ledger. My name is Eleanor Hayes. For the record, I am the majority shareholder of Langley Innovations, listed under nominee equities to respect my mother's instructions. I am also the trustee of the Hayes Family Trust. The words landed like bricks in the chandelier's light. Gasps, A woman dropped her champagne glass. Margaret's face dissolved into practiced outrage. "You can't," she whispered. I explained calmly how company funds had been directed to personal expenses. I slid a single printed page toward the front where the local columnist leaned forward. A redacted invoice from Langley Innovations to Marcus Holdings for $18,000 labeled consulting that was, in fact, a deposit into Marcus's account. I explained how luxury jewelry had been coded as client entertainment. I showed bank reconciliations that matched logos of stores located in boutiques named for Chloe's purchases. Then I announced the actions already underway. As of this afternoon, a forensic audit has been opened and served on Langley Innovations for fiscal irregularities. Notice of alias pendens has been recorded against the marital residence. A board resolution, signed by the nominees who were present at the January cap table meeting, has been circulated to remove Richard Hayes from any executive function until these matters are resolved. And a civil complaint for constructive fraud and conversion will be filed within 5 business days. I let the words hang. There was a short, electric silence, the kind that reveals the absence of the sound you once took for granted. I could feel the heat from Margaret's stare. Richard looked like a man who had been airlifted into humiliation. Chloe's phone slipped from her hand. Samantha's smile froze, as if the plastic had become brittle. Then I revealed the final blow. I had saved it for the exact theatrical instant when spectacle mattered. "Margaret," I said, looking directly at her, "you and Richard attempted to disguise personal spending as corporate expense for years. You asked me to sign away my rights, then you sought to erase me. Because I am dedicated to truth, I exercised my authority under the Hayes Trust to transfer the deed of the marital residence into an asset protection LLCI control. That deed was recorded 3 days ago. Any attempt to transfer the property or to mortgage it without disclosure is now impossible without my signature. Furthermore, because of the forensic audit we've initiated, the bank accounts used as slush funds have been frozen pending investigation." The room reacted like a body to a jab. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. Chloe began to hyperventilate. Richard sprang to his feet. "You can't take our home," he shouted, a sound that ricocheted off framed photographs like bad glass. "I didn't take anything," I said, my voice low and steady. "I executed trust provisions that have been dormant only because your greed allowed them to be. I protected an asset from becoming your creditor's collateral." I slid another paper across the lectern, minutes from a cap table meeting showing the nominee votes that authorized the board resolution to suspend Richard, a sealed letter addressed to the SEC outlining suspected misstatements in public filings tied to personal expenses. What followed was theater. Margaret fainted into a pew with a thud that made the club manager gasp. Chloe screamed about public humiliation and ran for the restroom. Samantha's boyfriend, who had been standing in a nearby cluster, grabbed his coat and bolted. A reporter asked a question about arrests. I answered without vanity. "There will be no arrests tonight," I said. "There will be an audit, a civil suit, and a chance for them to make restitution. The law will now do what family failed to do: ask for the truth." Richard lunged toward the lectern like a man who expected physical dominance to restore the ledger. Security, who had been watching from the club's private entrance after I tipped them off to potential disturbance, stepped between us. He tried to pull me aside and whisper that this was a scandal he would fix. I let the microphone pick up his mutter. "You're ruining us." "No," I said into a live microphone. "You ruined us." The press had already started snapping pictures. Within hours, the boutique auditor posted the notice of the pending audit, and a local column wrote a piece that led to a thread of creditors calling in. Anonymity evaporated. It was less like watching a building burn and more like watching a carefully rigged mechanism, springs, levers, and locks release in the order I had designed. The fear in their eyes was the only human detail that remained, and even that had an expiration date. After the event, their apologies arrived like undercooked bread. Cold, insincere, and too late. Margaret sent a florist with a note about misunderstandings. Chloe posted an Instagram about learning lessons. Richard left voice messages full of regret and blame, the classic combination that tries to make confession a bargaining chip. They called, they begged, they tried to frame me as cruel. "We made mistakes," Richard said on the phone, throat thick with manufactured remorse. "We'll pay it back. Please don't press charges." The boutique auditor replied with a polite yet unyielding email explaining the process. The bank confirmed the freeze. The board sent a unanimous notice that, pending audit findings, Richard's executive privileges would be suspended. Creditors filed claims that required a mediated settlement analysis. Marcus received notices that his corporation's accounts were being subpoenaed. Chloe's credit card company called concerning suspicious transactions. They came to our house, the house that was now a legal tomb of liens and notices, on a raw Sunday, and banged on the front door like people who used to hold keys. They wept. Margaret repeated the same line she'd used for years. "We were trying to protect the family name." Chloe sobbed about being a young woman who made mistakes. Richard knelt in a way that had previously announced humility and now reeked of theater. I locked the door and watched them from the window, their heads bowed like people who had been caught in a storm of their own making. I opened the door to let them in no more. The law had done the heavy lifting. My refusal was not a flash of cruelty. It was a permanent boundary. I delivered one sentence that lodged like a verdict. "I will not be your emergency exit," I said. "You burned every bridge that kept you safe. You wanted the house as an asset and Samantha as a garnish. You turned family into a ledger and expected no consequence. That stops." They begged to keep their jewelry. I refused. They begged for job references. I held legal forms like a barricade. They offered to sign repayment plans that required the very signatures they no longer controlled. I recommended counsel. Months later, the company settled for a civil penalty and agreed to a formal oversight committee. Richard was forced to tender his resignation. Margaret's name, once synonymous with the country club's harmless opulence, trended in velvet indignation and then in polite condemnation. Chloe's public brand crashed and took months to rebuild because her credit problems were now public, her purchases documented in audit appendices. Marcus faced litigation. Samantha's phone lost service. As for me, the aftermath was quieter than the spectacle had been. The deed transfer I had placed as protection ensured the house remained an asset of a trust with high ethical covenants. I sold the property a year later, not in haste, not out of spite, but because I wanted the mortgage and the public reminders gone. I used the proceeds to fund a small scholarship in my mother's name for women studying forensic accounting and to support a community center in the town where we had once been forced to volunteer. I took the bus sometimes, out of habit and to feel grounded, but I never again let anyone decide my dignity. When they pleaded for a second chance, I refused. The law had been an instrument of accountability. My life afterward became an exercise in deliberate kindness, on my terms. I relearned how to open a jar of jam without an apology. I learned to say no and to mean it. The people who had been cruel learned the far more difficult lesson of living with the consequences. On quiet evenings, when the house was empty and the kettle sang, I would open the laptop and scroll through the audit's dense appendices, not to relish shame, but to understand where greed had grown and how to build better safeguards. The relief was not in seeing them fall, but in seeing a ledger close on a life that had once been an inventory of insults. If you are watching this and you carry a similar quiet power, money hidden for reasons of safety, knowledge that could save you, remember this: patience is a blade only when guided by the law and compassion. Revenge without structure tends to breathe chaos. My revenge was surgical because it was lawful, precise, and proportionate. I do not relish suffering. I value truth. The moral of my story is not that revenge is sweet. It's that accountability is necessary. I protected assets, exposed theft, and refused to let entitlement stand unchallenged. In the end, I reclaimed my dignity and my life. If you liked this long-form story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And remember, boundaries are not cruelty. They are a kind of love for yourself, for truth, and for a future without the same predators.